She woke to the smell of her own flesh burning. Again. Sarah Morgan opened her eyes at 5 in the morning, same as every morning for the past 10 years. And the first sensation was always the same, the acrid, sweet, sick odor of skin being destroyed by metal. Pure silver, 3 inches wide, locked around both wrists, with no gap for air, no space for healing, no mercy built into the design. The bands had been there since she was 12 years old. They would be there until she died, which according to the last healer's assessment would happen sometime around age 27, maybe 28 if her body kept surprising everyone by refusing to quit. She lay still for a moment, letting her mind catalog the damage before her body had to move and make everything worse. Left wrist deep burning sensation, probably another infection, starting in the tissue that never fully closed. Right wrist sharper pain, the kind that meant nerve damage was progressing, eating its way up her forearm in increments she measured by how many dishes she dropped each week. Both hands, that familiar numbness below the band's fingers, she could see, moving but barely feel like watching someone else's hands perform tasks through thick gloves. The clock on the wall read 5:03 a.m. She had 57 minutes before her shift started in the packhouse kitchens. 57 minutes to make herself look human enough that no one would ask questions, functional enough that she could carry trays and chop vegetables and pretend the silver bands locked around her wrists were just old injuries, minor inconveniences, nothing that warranted concern or conversation. Sarah sat up slowly, testing her balance. The constant silver exposure affected more than just her wrists. It leached into her bloodstream, accumulated in her organs, weakened everything it touched. She'd learned to move carefully, to anticipate the moments when her body simply wouldn't respond the way 22-year-old bodies were supposed to respond. Most days she felt 70. Some days she felt dead already, just too stubborn to stop moving. The routine took 40 minutes. She'd timed it down to a science. First, examine the wounds. She unwrapped yesterday's bandages, watching the cloth stick to dried blood and fluid where the burns wept constantly. The silver bands gleamed dully in the pre-dawn light, and beneath them the flesh was angry red, where it wasn't black with necrosis, puffy with inflammation, where it wasn't sunken with dead tissue. 10 years of this. The scars had scars, layers upon layers of damage that would never heal as long as the metal remained pressed against skin. She cleaned the wounds with supplies she kept hidden in her tiny room, basic antiseptic and gauze, that she stole in small amounts from the pack house medical supplies. Not enough to be missed, never enough to actually help, just enough to prevent the worst infections from taking hold and killing her before her time. The ointment went on next, a cheap antibacterial cream that did almost nothing against the constant silver burn, but made her feel like she was doing something, taking some action against the torture that defined her existence. She worked it into the edges where metal met flesh, wincing as her damaged nerves sent confused signals, burning numbness, stabbing pain, nothing at all of it happening simultaneously. Then the bandages. 4 layers of cloth wrapped carefully around each wrist, tight enough to hold everything in place and hide the worst of the damage, but loose enough that she could still bend her hands, still grip things with her weakened fingers. She'd learned the exact tension through trial and error, through years of adjusting, until the wrapping became automatic muscle memory. Her body performed while her mind was somewhere else. The painkillers came last. She kept a secret stash of over-the-counter pills she'd accumulated through careful theft and barter, hidden in a hole she'd dug behind the loose baseboard in her room. They didn't work. Not really, not against this kind of constant agony. But taking them was another ritual, another small act of defiance against the pack that had decided her pain was acceptable, necessary just. She dressed in her kitchen uniform, plain gray shirt with long sleeves that covered the bandages, black pants that had seen better days, non-slip shoes she'd inherited from another servant who'd left the pack 2 years ago. Everything was designed to make her invisible, unremarkable, easy to overlook. She braided her dark hair back from her face and avoided looking at herself in the cracked mirror above her sink. The woman reflected there was a stranger anyway, hollow-eyed and gaunt, aged beyond her years by suffering. At 5:47 a.m., she left her room in the servants' quarters and walked the empty hallways to the kitchen, her footsteps echoing on stone floors that had witnessed 10 years of her diminishment. The pack house was quiet this early, only a few wolves stirring. No one who paid attention to the damaged Omega who worked in the kitchens. That was what they called her now, what they'd called her since the bans went on Omega. The weakest designation, the acceptable role for females in the pack hierarchy. Never mind that she'd been born something else entirely. The silver made sure no one remembered. She worked alone for the first hour prepping vegetables for breakfast service, while her wrists screamed and her fingers fumbled, and she thought about nothing at all because thinking led to remembering, and remembering led to the kind of pain that made the physical burning seem almost trivial by comparison. The ceremony had been planned for weeks. First shifts were major events in Iron Ridge Pack, celebrated with the entire community gathered to witness a child's entry into their true heritage. Sarah's 12th birthday had passed 3 days prior, and the Pack elders had declared her ready for transformation. Her parents had been proud, excited to see what kind of wolf their daughter would become. Her mother, Linda, had spent hours helping her prepare brushing her hair until it shone, dressing her in traditional ceremonial clothes, whispering encouragement about how special this moment would be. Her father, Robert, had stood with the other pack members, his chest puffed with anticipation, already imagining which of his daughter's traits would manifest in her wolf form. Would she be quick like her mother, strong like him, clever like her grandmother, who'd been legendary for her strategic mind during pack disputes? No one had considered that she might be Alpha. Alpha was a male designation, everyone knew that. Pack structure depended on it, alphas at the top, male authority, unquestioned strength, and dominance concentrated in the wolves who could be trusted with power. Females were beta or omega supportive roles, important, certainly, but operating within bounds that kept the hierarchy stable. The ceremony began at dusk. 300 pack members gathered in the clearing, used for all major rituals, arranged in traditional semicircles around the ceremonial fire. Sarah stood at the center, 12 years old and trembling with anticipation, surrounded by expectations she didn't yet understand would destroy her. Elder Marcus Stone presided from his position of honor among the pack elders, his gray hair and weathered face marking him as someone who'd held authority for decades. Beside him sat 14 other elders, the council that made all major decisions for Iron Ridge, their expressions solemn and ceremonial. The shift itself hurt more than anyone had warned her about. Sarah felt her bones begin to break and reform, felt her muscles tear and rebuild, felt her entire body transform in ways that made her want to scream, but she held it in because this was supposed to be sacred, supposed to be beautiful. She felt her knees gasping through the agony, her human form giving way to something else entirely. When the transformation completed, when she stood on 4 legs for the first time, the silence was absolute. Her wolf was massive, larger than any female wolf should be, nearly matching the size of full-grown male alphas. Her fur was silver white, gleaming in the firelight, like moonlight given form. But it wasn't her size or coloring that made every wolf present freeze in shock. It was the presence radiating from her, the undeniable sensation of pure alpha dominance that made even adult wolves instinctively lower their heads in submission. She was an alpha female. Impossible. Wrong. The first sound came from Elder Marcus, who stood from his seat with an expression of absolute horror. His voice cut through the stunned silence like a blade. This cannot be. Females cannot be alphas. This is not possible. Other elders began murmuring agreement, their voices rising in a crescendo of shock and disgust. Sarah didn't understand what was happening, didn't comprehend why the celebration had turned into something dark and frightening. She looked for her parents, seeking reassurance, seeking someone to explain what was wrong. Her father's face had gone pale, his expression shifting from pride to horror to shame in rapid succession. He stared at Sarah's wolf form as if she had become something monstrous, something that disgusted him. Her mother had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of joy. They were tears of devastation. "This is your daughter," Elder Marcus demanded, turning to her father. "You sired this abomination. I didn't know." Her father's voice came out, desperate, pleading. "I swear I didn't know this was possible. There's never been anything like this in our bloodline. I don't understand how this happened." Another elder stood, his voice sharp with authority. "It doesn't matter how it happened. What matters is correcting it before this corruption spreads. An alpha female threatens everything our society is built upon. If word spreads that such things are possible, it will undermine male authority, challenge the hierarchy, create chaos." Sarah tried to shift back to human form, tried to escape the wolf shape that was causing such horror, but she didn't know how. She was trapped in this form that everyone found revolting, unable to defend herself or explain or do anything except stand there while the pack elders debated her fate. Execution would be cleanest, one elder suggested. Simply put the abomination down before it becomes aware of what it is. No, Marcus's voice carried cold calculation rather than mercy. Execution would raise questions. Others would want to know why. Better to correct the issue to suppress this alpha wolf so thoroughly that it can never surface again. Let her live, but ensure she lives as she should have been born, as a proper Omega female. A man stepped forward from the crowd, someone Sarah recognized as the pack's silversmith, Thomas Crane. Silver suppresses shifter abilities. In small amounts, it causes discomfort. In larger amounts, direct contact with skin, it can prevent shifting entirely. If we were to make bands, thick ones, tight ones, locked directly against her wrists, where the silver concentration would be highest, it would cage her alpha wolf permanently. The silver would burn her constantly. Someone objected. Direct contact for extended periods would cause severe damage. Better that than allowing an alpha female to exist uncorrected. Marcus's words sealed her fate. The discomfort is a small price for ensuring she never accesses this abomination again. Thomas, can you make such bands? Thomas nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I can. I'll need precise measurements to ensure they fit tight enough, and I'll need to craft locks that cannot be picked or removed without a key that only I possess. But yes, I can make suppression bands that will cage an alpha wolf for life. Then do so, Marcus commanded. Immediately. We'll hold the child until the bands are ready. They kept Sarah in wolf form in a silver-lined cage while Thomas crafted the bands. 3 days. 3 days where she remained trapped in the shape everyone hated, unable to shift back, barely able to move in the cramped cage. The silver bars burned wherever she touched them, leaving marks on her fur and skin that didn't heal. She whimpered constantly, frightened and confused, and desperate for her parents to come rescue her, but they never came. Her father visited once, staring at her through the bars with an expression of deep shame. This is for your own good. His voice held no conviction. You'll understand someday. We're saving you, Sarah. This is mercy. Her mother never visited at all. On the 4th day, Thomas arrived with the completed bands. They were 3 inches wide, made of pure silver, with intricate locks built into the design. The inside surface was smooth, but would rest directly against skin, with no gap for air or healing. They were instruments of torture disguised as correction. They dragged Sarah from the cage and forced her to shift back to human form, though the process was agony after being locked as a wolf for days. When she was finally human again, naked and shivering and terrified, they held her down while Thomas fitted the bands. Sarah screamed when the silver first touched her wrists. The burning was immediate and excruciating, unlike anything she had ever experienced. She begged them to stop, promised to be good, to never shift again, to do anything they wanted if they would just remove the silver. But they ignored her pleas, forcing her arms straight, while Thomas positioned the bands and locked them tight. The tighter, the better, Marcus instructed. No gap for healing, constant contact, constant suppression. Thomas tightened the bands until they cut into Sarah's flesh, until she couldn't slip even a fingernail between metal and skin. The locks clicked shut with finality, and he handed the only keys to Marcus. These bands will not come off without these keys. The silver is pure and will burn constantly. Her wolf will be suppressed within days, caged completely within weeks. She will be unable to shift while wearing them. Perfect. Marcus looked down at Sarah, who was sobbing on the floor, her wrists already blistering from the silver. You will wear these until you die. They are your correction, your punishment for being born wrong. But know this, child, we are being merciful. Other packs would simply execute an alpha female. We are allowing you to live. Be grateful. They left her there, a 12-year-old child with silver burning into her wrists, her alpha wolf already beginning to retreat from the agony. Sarah chopped vegetables with mechanical precision, her damaged hands fumbling the knife, but muscle memory carrying her through motions she'd performed thousands of times. The kitchen slowly filled with other staff as morning progressed, workers who nodded at her but rarely spoke, who'd learned years ago that the broken Omega with the bandaged wrists wasn't worth befriending. She existed in their peripheral vision, functional but forgettable. Year 1 had been the hardest in terms of acute suffering. At 12 years old, Sarah's body was still growing, But the silver bands did not expand with her. They became tighter as her wrists tried to grow the metal cutting deeper, the burning intensifying. She spent most of that first year crying herself to sleep, the agony so intense that nothing else existed beyond it. Her parents moved her to the servants' quarters after 3 months, unable to bear having a constant reminder of their shame living in the family home. Sarah was given a tiny room in the back of the pack house and told she would work for her keep. At 12, still adjusting to bands that never stopped burning, she was expected to begin earning the right to continue living in Iron Ridge. The work started simple cleaning, carrying basic tasks that even a child could manage. But as Sarah grew older and the band's effects became more profound, she found even simple work exhausting. The constant silver exposure weakened her entire body, not just her wrists. Her healing was severely compromised. Her strength never developed as it should have. She remained perpetually frail, perpetually struggling, perpetually in pain. Year 2 brought the first serious infection. The burns beneath the bands had never properly healed, and bacteria eventually found the open wounds. Sarah developed a fever so high that she became delirious, her body fighting an infection it was too weak to overcome on its own. The pack healer treated her with strong antibiotics, though her expression suggested she believed Sarah would die. "The silver needs to come off," the healer told Elder Marcus bluntly. "The infection is spreading. If the bands remain, she will likely die from sepsis." "Then she dies," Marcus had said with chilling indifference. "Better that than removing her correction. If she survives the infection, she will be stronger for it. If she does not, then the problem resolves itself." Sarah survived, though she never knew how. The fever broke after 5 days, the infection gradually clearing with continued antibiotics. But the close call taught her that her life had exactly as much value as the pack deemed it had, which was essentially none. She was a corrected abomination, allowed to live only as long as she caused no trouble and asked for nothing. Year 3 was when the nerve damage became apparent. Constant silver exposure was destroying the nerves in her wrists and hands, causing numbness in her fingers, weakness in her grip, occasional shooting pains that felt like lightning running from wrist to fingertips. The pack healer warned that permanent nerve damage was likely inevitable, that Sarah might lose function in her hands entirely if the bands remained much longer. No one cared. The bands stayed on. Year 4 brought the realization that her wolf was essentially dead. Not literally, she could still sense a dim presence deep inside her, buried under layers of silver-induced suppression, but functionally dead. She hadn't accessed her wolf form in 2 years, couldn't shift no matter how she tried, could barely remember what it felt like to be anything except human and in pain. This was when depression set in properly. Sarah spent most of year 4 simply going through motions, working, when required sleeping, when possible existing without really living. What was the point of survival, when survival meant nothing but endless suffering? She was 14 years old and already wished she were dead. Year 5, she attempted to remove the bands herself. Late one night, alone in her tiny room, she used a stolen kitchen knife to try prying the locks open. She worked for hours, her hands slick with blood from where she'd cut herself in the attempt, but the locks wouldn't budge. Thomas had crafted them too well. They were designed to be permanent, to resist any attempt at removal. Finally exhausted and defeated, Sarah had given up and simply wept until dawn. Year 6 was marked by growing acceptance. This was her life. The bands would never come off. She would live with constant pain until the cumulative damage killed her, probably before she reached 30. There was no escape, no rescue, no hope for anything better. Accepting this reality made it somewhat easier to bear, though easier was relative when every moment still involved metal burning into flesh. She learned to cope in small ways. Wrapping her wrists in cloth bandages provided minimal protection from accidental impacts that would jar the bands and send fresh agony through her arms. Working in the kitchens kept her away from packed social activities where she might be questioned about her condition. Keeping her head down and her ambitions non-existent meant no one paid attention to her. Year 7 brought arthritis. The constant inflammation from the silver burns had spread to the joints in her wrists and hands, causing pain even beyond what the bands created directly. Her fingers began to swell. Her wrist mobility decreased. Her grip strength became almost non-existent. Simple tasks like holding a knife or lifting a pot became challenges that required careful planning and execution. The pack healer examined Sarah's wrists and hands with barely concealed disgust. The joint damage is permanent. The arthritis will only worsen with time. You'll likely lose most hand function before you're 30. Can anything be done, Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Remove the bands, the healer said flatly. That's the only solution. But since that won't happen, nothing can be done. You'll simply continue deteriorating until your hands are essentially useless. Year 8 was when Sarah stopped feeling most sensation in her fingers. The nerve damage had progressed to the point where she could barely feel anything below her wrists. She dropped things constantly, unable to gauge grip pressure. She cut herself regularly while cooking because she couldn't feel the knife properly. Her hands had become partially dead appendages attached to wrists that never stopped burning. This was also the year she overheard other servants talking about her. She should just kill herself. One woman said casually, as if discussing the weather, "What kind of life is that? Constant pain, useless hands, no future. Death would be a mercy." Part of Sarah agreed, but another part, stubborn, refusing to give the elders the satisfaction, insisted on surviving. She would live out of spite, if nothing else. Year 9 brought the realization that her bones were weakening. The silver exposure was affecting her calcium absorption, her bone density decreasing to dangerous levels. She fractured her left wrist, not the one with burns, but the actual bone beneath the band, simply from catching herself during a fall. The fracture didn't heal properly, leaving that wrist permanently weakened, prone to re-injury. The pack healer who set the fracture looked at Sarah with something approaching pity. "Your body is breaking down. The silver toxicity is systemic now, affecting everything. You have maybe 5 years left, possibly less. I'm sorry." Sarah was 21 years old and being told she had maybe 5 years to live. She felt nothing hearing it. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. What difference did it make when every day was the same suffering? Year 10 was the year Commander James Blackwood arrived in Iron Ridge. The announcement came 3 days before his arrival. A federal pack investigator would be conducting a routine inspection, reviewing pack operations, ensuring compliance with territorial laws. Alpha Derek Hayes had made the announcement with barely concealed anxiety, and Sarah understood why. Federal inspectors didn't come to well-run packs. They came when someone had filed a complaint, when something had gone wrong, when secrets were in danger of being exposed. Sarah paid little attention to the preparations. She was kitchen staff, invisible beneath the notice of visiting investigators. She would simply continue her work and wait for him to leave, same as she'd done through every other pack event that disrupted the normal routine. Commander Blackwood arrived on a Tuesday morning with a team of 4, a military-looking man who was introduced as Lieutenant Marcus Gray, a woman named Dr. Rebecca Torres, who carried herself with medical authority, and 2 younger agents whose names Sarah didn't catch. They set up operations in the pack house's administrative wing, converting conference rooms into temporary offices, requesting files and records and interviews. For 2 days, Sarah worked in the kitchen and heard only distant rumors about the investigation. Everything seemed routine. The commander was thorough but fair. He asked detailed questions but found nothing obviously wrong. Alpha Derek was tense but cooperative. The pack held its collective breath and hoped the Federals would complete their inspection and leave without incident. On the 3rd day, Sarah was carrying a tray of dishes from the main dining hall back to the kitchen when she stumbled. The stone floor in the corridor was uneven in places, worn down by decades of foot traffic and into dips and rises that most wolves navigated without thought. But Sarah's coordination was compromised by nerve damage, her balance affected by chronic weakness, and when her foot caught on one of the uneven spots, she went down. The tray fell, first dishes shattering against stone with a crash that echoed through the corridor. Sarah landed hard on her hands and knees, the impact jarring both wrists and sending a spike of agony through the damaged tissue beneath her bands. She couldn't suppress the gasp of pain that escaped, couldn't stop herself from cradling her wrists against her chest as tears sprang to her eyes. Strong hands caught her shoulders, helping her up. "Are you injured?" Sarah looked up into storm-gray eyes and realized with horror that Commander James Blackwood himself had witnessed her clumsiness. She tried to pull away, tried to deflect. "I'm fine, sir, just clumsy. I apologize for the disturbance." But the commander's grip didn't release. His eyes had moved to her wrists where the impact had shifted the cloth bandages slightly, revealing a glimpse of silver and burned flesh beneath. His expression changed instantly from concern to sharp focus. "What is that on your wrist?" "Nothing, sir. Old injury. Please, I must clean this mess. Sarah tried again to pull away, panic rising as she realized her secret was seconds from exposure. But the commander's voice took on a quality she recognized from years of submission to Alpha authority, a tone that made disobedience nearly impossible. Let me see your wrists. Now. Sarah's hands moved without conscious decision, unwrapping the cloth bandages to reveal the silver bands beneath. The metal gleamed dully in the quarter's light, and the flesh visible at the edges was angry. Red and black burned away in some places to expose deeper tissue scarred beyond recognition in others. Commander Blackwood stared at her wrists with an expression that cycled through shock, horror, and fury in rapid succession. He was silent for a long moment, simply staring at the evidence of a decade of torture. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. Explain these bands to me. Every detail. Who put them on you, when, and why? And if you tell me they were your choice, I'll know you're lying. Sarah swallowed hard. There was no escape now, no defection that would satisfy a federal investigator who had seen the evidence of her suffering. They were put on 10 years ago, when I was 12. The pack elders ordered it. Why? The commander pressed his eyes, never leaving her wrists. What could a 12-year-old child have possibly done to deserve this torture? I shifted for the first time. Sarah heard her own voice emerge hollow and detached. My wolf was alpha female. The elders said it was an abomination that alpha females cannot exist, that I needed to be corrected. The bands suppressed my wolf. Keep it caged. Ensure I live as I should have been born, as a proper omega female. The silence that followed was absolute. Commander Blackwood was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. His jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. When he spoke again, his voice carried barely controlled rage. They tortured a child. They locked silver bands, pure silver from the look of it, directly against the skin of a 12-year-old girl. They burned her constantly for 10 years because her wolf was alpha and she was female. Is that what you're telling me? Yes, sir. And your parents, where were they when this was done to you, person? Sarah looked away, unable to meet his eyes. My father agreed it was necessary. My mother said nothing. They moved me to servants' quarters after 3 months. I haven't spoken to either of them in years. Lieutenant Gray appeared in the corridor, drawn by the sound of breaking dishes and the commander's raised voice. He took one look at Sarah's wrists and his face went pale. Jesus Christ. Commander Blackwood's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his entire body radiating fury, barely held in check. His voice came out measured, controlled, but Sarah could hear the rage underneath. Alpha females are not abominations. They are rare, yes, but they are blessed by the moon goddess just as any other wolf. The fact that ignorant traditions have tried to erase them doesn't make their existence wrong. He moved closer to Sarah, his presence overwhelming, but somehow not threatening. These bands are killing you. I can see it, feel it. You're weak, damaged, dying slowly from a decade of constant silver exposure. How long before the toxicity becomes fatal? 5 years, 3. The healer said 5 years, Sarah admitted. Maybe less, but sir, there's nothing to be done. The bands are locked. Only the pack silversmith has the keys. And even if they came off, my wolf has been suppressed so long, I'm not sure it would surface again. I'm essentially human now. A very damaged human. No, the commander's voice was firm. You're a suppressed alpha female who has survived a decade of torture that would have killed most wolves years ago. That takes strength, Sarah, not weakness. But these bands end now, today. I will not leave Iron Ridge, knowing a child was tortured and continues to be tortured under my authority. You can't remove them without the keys, Sarah protested, and Thomas won't give them to you. He answers to the pack elders, not to visiting investigators. Then I won't ask Thomas. Commander Blackwood's hands moved to her left wrist, his grip gentle despite the determination in his eyes. I'll simply break the locks. It will hurt you. I can't remove bands that have been locked in place for 10 years without causing damage. But Sarah, they have to come off. You can't continue like this. Sir, please, tell me you want to keep wearing them. The commander cut her off. Tell me you want to continue burning, continue dying slowly, continue living with metal, destroying your flesh every moment. Tell me that's what you want, and I'll leave them in place. But if any part of you wants to be free, wants a chance at healing, wants to know what life could be without this torture, then let me help you. Sarah looked at her wrists, at the silver bands that had defined her existence for 10 years. They were familiar, constant, the only life she had known since 12 years old. Removing them would mean pain, would mean confronting a wolf she barely remembered, would mean facing pack judgment without the excuse of correction. But the commander was right. She was dying. The bands were killing her, slowly ensuring she would never see 30. And some part of her, the part that had survived out of spite, that had refused to give the elders the satisfaction of death, wanted to be free. "I want them off," she whispered. "But sir, truly, it will hurt terribly. The bands have been locked so long that flesh has essentially fused to the metal. Removing them will tear skin, will cause bleeding that won't stop easily because the silver has compromised my healing. Are you certain you want to cause me that pain? I'm certain I want to free you from a torture that never should have been inflicted." The commander said, "The pain of removal will be temporary. The pain of keeping them on is permanent." "Yes, Sarah, I'm certain. Gray, get Dr. Torres. We're doing this now. Medical bay, full emergency supplies ready. And find Alpha Derek. I want him there to witness what his pack has done." Lieutenant Gray moved immediately, speaking into a radio as he disappeared down the corridor. Commander Blackwood kept his grip on Sarah's wrist, not tight enough to hurt, but firm enough that she couldn't pull away even if she'd wanted to. Within 5 minutes, they were in the pack's medical bay, a sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and silver. Dr. Torres had transformed the space into an emergency treatment area, supplies laid out with military efficiency. Alpha Derek stood against one wall, his face pale as he took in Sarah's exposed wrists. Two other agents were present, one operating a camera to document everything, the other taking written notes. "This is going to hurt," Dr. Torres said to Sarah, her voice professional but not unkind. "The commander is right that the bands have to come off, but I need you to understand you will be in severe pain. We'll manage the bleeding and treat the wounds, but the removal itself will be traumatic. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She sat on the examination table, her wrists extended, and watched Commander Blackwood position himself beside her. His hands gripped the left band, and she could see the muscles in his forearms tensing as he prepared to apply force. "I'm sorry this will hurt." His voice was quiet, meant only for her. "But I'm not sorry for freeing you." He pulled. The silver band resisted for a moment, locked tight as it had been for a decade. Then the commander's strength, AlphaKing strength that exceeded normal wolves, bent the metal. The lock cracked with a sound like breaking bone. The band came loose and took skin with it. Sarah screamed. The band had been locked so long, had burned so deep that flesh had essentially fused to the metal. Removing it tore away layers of skin, exposed raw tissue beneath, caused bleeding that erupted freely now that the silver suppressing her healing was gone. The pain was beyond anything Sarah had experienced, beyond what she thought pain could be, a tearing agony that made the 10 years of burning seem almost trivial by comparison. Commander Blackwood caught her before she collapsed, supporting her weight while she sobbed. I know it hurts, but it's done. One band is off. Your left wrist is free." Sarah looked at her left wrist through tears. The silver band lay on the tray beside the examination table, blood and tissue still clinging to its inner surface. Her wrist was a horror of burned and torn flesh, bleeding freely, damaged beyond what seemed survivable. But it was also free. For the first time in 10 years, there was no silver touching her left wrist. Torres moved immediately, applying pressure to stop the bleeding, beginning to clean the wound with swift professional motions. Her voice was steady as she worked. "The tissue damage is severe but manageable. The bleeding is actually a good sign, means her healing hasn't been completely destroyed. We'll get this bandaged and move to the other wrist." "The other one," Commander Blackwood set his eyes on Sarah. "I need to remove the other one. Can you endure it?" Sarah wanted to say no, wanted to beg him to stop, to leave the remaining band in place rather than subject her to that agony again. But she also wanted to be free, wanted both wrists liberated, wanted her wolf to have a chance at surfacing after a decade in a silver cage. "Do it," she whispered. The second removal was worse because she knew what was coming. Commander Blackwood gripped the right band and pulled with the same brutal efficiency. More skin tore away. More blood flowed. More screaming that Sarah couldn't suppress no matter how hard she tried. And then it was done. Both bands lay on the tray. Both wrists were free. Sarah was sobbing in the commander's arms while he held her and murmured reassurances she could barely hear over the sound of her own agony. Dr. Torres worked quickly, cleaning wounds, applying specialized bandages designed for severe burns, administering painkillers that would take the edge off but couldn't touch the deep tissue damage. It's done, Commander Blackwood said finally. The silver is gone. Your wrists are free. Now we need to let you heal and give your wolf a chance to emerge. Sarah, you've been suppressed for 10 years. When your wolf finally surfaces, it may be violent or overwhelming, but I'll be here. You're safe. I promise you're safe. Sarah could barely process his words through the pain. She was aware of being moved to a recovery room of clean sheets and dim lights, and Dr. Torres checking her vital signs every few minutes. She was aware of Alpha Derek being questioned in harsh tones by Lieutenant Gray somewhere outside her door. She was aware of something stirring deep inside her, something that had been caged for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. Her alpha wolf, sensing freedom for the first time in a decade, began to claw its way toward the surface. The shift came 3 days after the ban removal, and it felt like dying. Sarah woke in the middle of the night with her bones on fire. Not the familiar burn of silver against skin that was gone, now replaced by bandages and healing salve, but something deeper, something that came from inside her marrow and spread outward like molten metal being poured into a mold that hadn't been used in years. She tried to call for help, but her voice came out as a whimper, and then her spine arched backward and she felt her human form beginning to shatter. Torres was there immediately, must have been monitoring from the next room. Commander Blackwood appeared seconds later, still dressed despite the late hour, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Sarah heard their voices, but couldn't process words, couldn't think past the sensation of her body tearing itself apart and rebuilding into something it had been forbidden to become for a decade. Every bone broke and reformed. Every muscle tore and regrew. Every nerve fired at maximum intensity as her nervous system tried to remember pathways it hadn't accessed since she was 12 years old. She screamed through it, the sound morphing from human to animal, as her vocal cords changed shape, and some distant part of her mind thought that maybe the elders had been right, maybe this was wrong, maybe she should have stayed broken and human rather than endure this agony. And then the transformation completed. Sarah stood on 4 legs in the medical bay, her silver-white fur reflecting the overhead lights, and felt the full weight of her alpha presence slam back into existence like a dam breaking after years of pressure. The sensation was overwhelming, intoxicating, terrifying. She could feel every living thing in a 100-yard radius, could sense their hierarchical positions relative to her own, could taste the instinctive submission radiating from the wolves who felt her emergence. Dr. Torres had taken 3 steps backward, her head lowered despite obvious attempts to maintain professional composure. Through the open door, Sarah could see other pack members in the hallway, all of them frozen in postures of automatic deference to an alpha presence they couldn't resist. Only Commander Blackwood remained standing tall, his storm gray eyes meeting hers without flinching. Then he shifted his own transformation, taking seconds where hers had taken minutes, and his massive black wolf stood before her, radiating even more power than her alpha form. He approached carefully, respectfully, and touched his nose to hers in the traditional greeting between equals. The mate bond snapped into place with a force that drove Sarah to her knees. She felt it even through the disorientation of finally being her true self again, felt the recognition of destiny, the certainty that this AlphaKing was hers and she was his, the connection the moon goddess had decreed. It wasn't romantic, not yet, maybe not ever in the traditional sense, but it was undeniable. This wolf understood her in ways no one else could. This wolf had freed her when freedom seemed impossible. This wolf would stand beside her through whatever came next. From the look in Blackwood's dark eyes, he felt it too. They remained in wolf form for hours. Sarah's body needed time to adjust, to remember how to exist in this shape, to relearn movements and senses that had been denied for so long. Commander Blackwood stayed beside her, the entire time his presence a constant source of stability as her wolf self reoriented to freedom. He didn't push, didn't demand, simply existed as an anchor while she found her footing. When they finally shifted back to human form, when Sarah was herself again, but forever changed by having reclaimed her wolf, she looked at the commander and said the words that had become undeniable. "You're my mate. I felt it when you shifted." His voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "The bond is real, Sarah. You're mine and I'm yours. The moon goddess chose an alpha female for me, and I couldn't be more certain she chose right." Lieutenant Gray appeared in the doorway, tactfully keeping his eyes averted while they were both still unclothed and processing the bond recognition. When he spoke, his voice carried urgency that cut through the moment. "Commander, we need to move forward with the formal investigation. Marcus Stone is already mobilizing his legal defense, and Alpha Derek is requesting a meeting." The investigation, Sarah felt reality crash back in, felt the weight of what came next. The bans were off, her wolf was free, but the pack that had tortured her for 10 years wasn't going to simply accept federal intervention without resistance. Commander Blackwood's expression hardened into something professional, authoritative, the federal investigator rather than the mate who just recognized his destined bond. He pulled on clothes that Gray had brought, then turned back to Sarah. "You need to rest, let your body finish healing. But tomorrow I need your full statement. Everything that happened, everyone who was involved, every detail you can remember. We're building a case and you're the primary witness." Sarah nodded, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming, now that the adrenaline of shifting was fading. She was aware of Dr. Torres helping her dress, of being guided back to the recovery room, of voices discussing medical protocols and legal procedures. She fell asleep to the sound of Commander Blackwood giving orders to his team, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who would not be deterred from justice. The formal interview began at 9 the following morning in a conference room that had been converted into an evidence collection center. Sarah sat across a table from Commander Blackwood and Lieutenant Gray, a recording device between them capturing every word. Agent David Park operated a camera from the corner documenting her statement visually. Dr. Torres was present as both medical expert and victim advocate, positioned to intervene if the questioning became too traumatic. Commander Blackwood began with basic information, name, age, current status within the pack, before moving to the night of her first shift. Sarah described the ceremony in detail, the 300 witnesses, her parents' pride turning to horror. Elder Marcus Stone's immediate declaration that she was an abomination. She recounted being kept in the silver cage for 3 days, while Thomas Crane crafted the bands her parents' visits, or lack thereof, the moment when they locked metal around her 12-year-old wrists and told her to be grateful for mercy. Lieutenant Gray took notes with military precision, stopping her occasionally to clarify names, dates, specific quotes. "How many elders were on the council that ordered your suppression 15? Can you name them?" Sarah listed everyone, her memory perfect, because she'd spent 10 years thinking about the people who decided her suffering was acceptable. The interview lasted 4 hours with scheduled breaks every 45 minutes. By the end, Sarah had provided a complete timeline of her decade in the bands, every infection and complication, every time the pack healer had recommended removal, and been overruled every moment when she'd contemplated death as preferable to continued existence. Agent Park's camera captured her showing the permanent scars on her wrists, the nerve damage that made her fingers tremble slightly, the arthritis visible in her swollen joints. When it was over, Commander Blackwood leaned back in his chair and studied her with an expression that combined respect and fury. "You survived what should have killed you. That takes strength most alphas never develop. But Sarah, I need to ask, are you willing to testify publicly about what happened to you? Because this investigation is going to become very visible very quickly." "What do you mean?" "I mean that what was done to you wasn't isolated." Gray's voice was quiet but intense. "We've started preliminary inquiries with other packs in the Northern Territories, and we're finding patterns. Rumors of other alpha females who disappeared or died young. Medical records that don't quite add up. Too many families with stories about daughters who were sickly or troubled before convenient accidents. You think there are more victims?" Sarah's voice came out flat, already knowing the answer. "I think this has been happening systematically for longer than 10 years. Commander Blackwood's hands were clenched on the table. "I think Elder Marcus Stone isn't an anomaly. I think he's part of a network that's been suppressing and killing alpha females for decades, maybe longer. And I think the only way to stop it is to expose the entire system. But that requires witnesses willing to go public, and you're the only living victim we've found who's strong enough to testify." Sarah looked at her scarred wrists, at the permanent evidence of torture that would mark her for life. She thought about this girl she'd been at 12, excited for her first shift, destroyed by pack judgment. She thought about Thomas Crane's face when he'd fitted the bands, the resignation of someone following orders he didn't believe in. She thought about her parents who'd chosen compliance over protection. "I'll testify," she said. "Whatever you need, if there are others, if this has been happening to more than just me, then yes, I'll tell my story as many times as necessary." The investigation expanded rapidly over the following 2 weeks. Lieutenant Gray deployed to 6 neighboring packs with small teams requesting medical records and conducting interviews with families who'd lost daughters in suspicious circumstances. Dr. Torres established a forensics protocol for examining remains in cases where bodies had been preserved, looking for evidence of silver exposure or other suppression methods. Agent Park built a database tracking every potential case across the Northern Territories. Sarah remained in Iron Ridge, both recovering from her ordeal and serving as consultant to the investigation. Commander Blackwood kept her involved in strategy sessions, recognizing that her perspective as a survivor provided insights his team couldn't replicate. She helped craft interview questions that would put families at ease, identified pack dynamics that might explain why no one had intervened on victims' behalf, pointed out inconsistencies in official records based on her own experience being disappeared into servants' quarters. The mate bond complicated everything. Sarah felt it constantly now, an awareness of Commander Blackwood's presence, even when they were in different parts of the pack house, an instinctive knowledge of his emotional state that let her sense his growing fury as evidence accumulated. He never pushed the bond into romantic territory, never suggested that her status as his mate obligated her to anything beyond what she was willing to give. But she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that spoke of possession and protection in equal measure. On day 8 of the expanded investigation, Lieutenant Gray returned from Mountain View Pack with a 16-year-old girl named Emma Chen, who wore a silver collar around her neck. The collar was thinner than Sarah's bands had been, only an inch wide, but the effect was similar. Emma's wolf was suppressed, her alpha nature caged her flesh, showing the telltale burns of prolonged silver contact. She'd been wearing it since age 10, when her first shift revealed what the pack elders called an aberration. Her parents had agreed to the collar as an alternative to having their daughter removed from the pack entirely, told it was temporary until she learned proper submission. 6 years later, the collar remained locked in place. Torres examined Emma in the medical bay while Sarah sat nearby, her presence requested because Gray thought another suppressed alpha female might help the girl feel safe enough to cooperate. Emma was terrified, shaking as the doctor documented her injuries, clearly expecting punishment for the federal team's discovery of her condition. "You're not in trouble," Sarah said quietly. "None of this was your choice. They did this to you just like they did it to me." Emma's eyes went to Sarah's scarred wrists, recognition dawning. "You had bands for 10 years. They came off 2 weeks ago. It hurt like hell when they broke the locks, and my wrists are going to be scarred forever, but Emma being free is worth it." The girl started crying, then silent tears that spoke of years holding everything in. "I thought I was the only one. I thought I was broken, that something was wrong with me specifically. They said alpha females don't exist, that I was confused about what I felt during my shift. They lied." Commander Blackwood's voice came from the doorway, his presence making Emma flinch instinctively. He gentled his tone, moving into the room slowly. "Alpha females are rare, but real. You're not broken. You're not confused. You're exactly what the moon goddess created you to be, and these collars are torture devices designed to suppress something natural. With your permission, we'd like to remove it." Emma nodded frantically, then paused. "Will it hurt?" "Yes," Sarah answered before the commander could offer false comfort. "It's going to hurt worse than anything you have experienced because the silver has been there so long. But it's temporary pain, Emma. The pain you're feeling now is permanent." "I'd choose temporary again in a heartbeat." The collar removal went faster than Sarah's bands had, partly because it was thinner metal and partly because Commander Blackwood now had experience with the process. Emma screamed just as Sarah had sobbed just as hard when her neck was finally free of metal that had been burning her for 6 years. Dr. Torres worked efficiently, cleaning and bandaging the wound, administering pain medication, and monitoring for shock. That night, Emma shifted for the first time since age 10. Her alpha wolf was smaller than Sarah's younger and less developed, but the presence was unmistakable. Commander Blackwood shifted to greet her in the traditional way, and Sarah watched as the girl experienced the overwhelming relief of finally being herself without suppression. 2 suppressed alpha females found and freed. But Gray's reports from other packs were more grim than hopeful. In Clearwater Ridge, they found burial records for 2 girls aged 8 and 15, both listed as dying from natural causes 12 years prior. Exhumation revealed silver residue in bone tissue, evidence of prolonged exposure before death. The families, when questioned, admitted the girls had shifted into alpha females and been given suppression bands by pack elders. Both had died from complications, infections that became septic organs, failing under silver toxicity, and the families had been told to say nothing. In River Bend, a midwife confessed to suffocating 3 alpha female infants over 20 years. The pack elders had ordered it, she said through tears. They told me it was mercy, that letting them live would only cause suffering later. They told me alpha females who survived to adulthood went mad, became violent, destroyed their packs. I believed them. I murdered 3 babies because I believed them. In Storm Haven, Commander Blackwood's own pack, Agent Lisa Chen, discovered prenatal testing records that tracked genetic markers associated with alpha traits. Female fetuses testing positive were flagged for termination recommendations. The pack's medical director, when confronted, defended the practice as progressive. We prevent the suffering before it begins. No child has to endure suppression bans or execution if we simply ensure they're never born. The database grew daily, 53 cases documented across 15 packs spanning 30 years, 41 confirmed deaths through execution, suppression complications, or forced abortion, 7 cases of active suppression with devices like Sarah's bands or Emma's collar, 5 disappeared without bodies presumed dead, 0 cases of alpha females living free and integrated into pack society. It was systematic, it was coordinated, and at the center of it all was Elder Marcus Stone. The evidence came together on day 14. Agent Park compiled correspondence between pack elders across the Northern Territory's emails and letters discussing the alpha female problem like it was a policy issue rather than genocide. Marcus Stone's name appeared in 80% of the communications, always in leadership positions, always pushing for aggressive responses to any alpha female bursts. But the smoking gun was a document Thomas Crane provided after Lieutenant Gray questioned him for 6 hours. The Silver Protocol, 47 pages professionally formatted, distributed to 15 alpha leaders and their medical directors. It outlined identification procedures for alpha females, assessment criteria for determining whether suppression or execution was more appropriate, specifications for suppression devices, including precise silver purity requirements, long-term management protocols, and disposal procedures if suppression failed. It was a genocide instruction manual. Sarah read through it once and then had to leave the conference room to vomit. The clinical language, the matter-of-fact tone, discussing how to torture children or kill them efficiently, the careful attention to covering up evidence, it made her 10 years of suffering feel like just one data point in a much larger atrocity. Commander Blackwood found her in the bathroom afterward, crouched on the floor with her head against the cool tile. His presence through the mate bond had already told her he was coming, but she still flinched when he knelt beside her. This is bigger than Iron Ridge. His voice was hollow. This is industrialized genocide with procedural documentation. Marcus Stone built a network specifically to erase alpha females from existence, and he convinced other pack leaders it was necessary for social stability. How many more are there? Sarah looked up at him. How many alpha females died because of that document, because of those protocols? We'll never know the exact number. Probably hundreds over the years. Maybe thousands if this has been going on long enough. And you're going to prosecute all of them, all 15 packs. I'm going to try. But Sarah, you need to understand what's coming. Marcus Stone won't accept federal charges quietly. He's already building a legal defense based on pack sovereignty and traditional authority. He's going to argue that what was done to you was legal under pack law at the time that federal investigators have no jurisdiction over internal pack matters, that prosecuting him sets a dangerous precedent for government overreach. Sarah pushed herself to her feet using the bathroom counter for support. Her wrists ached. They always ached. Now the nerve damage permanent, but the pain was manageable, finite, nothing compared to the burning she'd endured for a decade. Let him argue. You have evidence. You have victims. You have that protocol document proving intent. How can pack sovereignty trump genocide? Because the law isn't always just. Commander Blackwood's expression was grim, because there are genuinely gray areas around pack autonomy versus federal authority. Because if I push too hard, Marcus Stone and his allies could trigger a civil war between traditionalist and progressive packs, and thousands of innocents would die. So what do? I build the strongest case possible, document everything, and pray that when this goes to tribunal, the judges prioritize justice over political expediency. The counterattack came on day 16. Sarah was working in the conference room with Agent Park cross-referencing victim names with PAC registry records when Lieutenant Gray burst through the door with his radio crackling urgent messages. We've got a problem. Marcus Stone just filed formal challenges with the Federal PAC Council. He's demanding the investigation be shut down immediately and all evidence suppressed as illegally obtained. On what grounds? Commander Blackwood was on his feet, immediately moving to read over Gray's shoulder. PAC sovereignty. Gray pulled up documents on his laptop. He's arguing that you violated Iron Ridge's autonomy by removing Sarah's bans without proper authority, that everything flowing from that illegal action is fruit of the poisonous tree, legally speaking. He's also filed complaints against you personally for excessive use of force and assault on a PAC member. Assault. Sarah's voice came out sharp. He freed me from torture. Stone is claiming you were under lawful correction and that forcibly removing the bans constituted assault on your person without proper consent procedures. Gray looked disgusted even reading the argument. He's also claiming that your subsequent testimony was coerced while you were traumatized and under the influence of pain medication, making it inadmissible. That's bullshit, and he knows it. Commander Blackwood's hands were clenched. But it's clever bullshit. He's trying to get ahead of formal charges by delegitimizing the entire investigation. There's more. Gray pulled up another document. He's not working alone. 12 other PAC alphas have filed supporting briefs arguing that federal interference in traditional PAC practices threatens their autonomy. They're demanding a full tribunal hearing on jurisdiction before any criminal charges can proceed. Sarah felt her chest tighten. 12 PACs supporting Marcus Stone meant 12 PACs that had probably implemented the Silver Protocol themselves, 12 PACs with alpha leaders who feared exposure if the investigation continued. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about an entire network of traditionalists fighting to preserve their right to commit genocide. How long until the tribunal? Commander Blackwood's voice was controlled professional, but Sarah could feel his fury through the mate bond. 3 weeks. The Federal PAC Council fast-tracked it given the serious nature of the allegations on both sides. You'll present your evidence. Stone will present his sovereignty defense, and 3 judges will rule on whether this investigation can continue. And if they rule against us, then Marcus Stone walks free. All 15 PAC leaders walk free. The Silver Protocol stays secret, and alpha females keep dying. Sarah stood up from her chair, her scarred wrists visible as she braced against the table. Then we make sure they don't rule against us. What do you need from me? Commander Blackwood studied her for a long moment. I need you to testify, in public in front of representatives from every PAC in the Northern Territories with your story recorded and broadcast. I need you to show them what was done to you and make them understand that no concept of PAC sovereignty justifies child torture. I already said I would. This will be different than our interview here. Gray's voice was gentle. Marcus Stone's lawyers will cross-examine you. They'll try to discredit your testimony, suggest you're exaggerating, or that you consented to the bans imply that your suffering was necessary for PAC stability. It's going to be brutal. Let it be brutal. Sarah met Commander Blackwood's eyes. I survived 10 years of silver burning into my wrists. I can survive a few lawyers asking hostile questions. The 3 weeks before the tribunal were the most intense of Sarah's life. Commander Blackwood's team worked around the clock preparing their case, compiling evidence, organizing testimony from families of victims, coordinating with forensic experts who could prove cause of death in cases where bodies had been exhumed. Dr. Torres prepped Sarah for the medical testimony, walking her through exactly what questions she'd be asked about her injuries and their long-term effects. Agent Chen coached her on courtroom procedures, how to answer questions clearly without being led into traps, how to maintain composure under aggressive cross-examination. Emma Chen agreed to testify as well, her parents supporting the decision despite fear of PAC retaliation. The Riverbend midwife, racked with guilt over the infant she'd killed, volunteered to describe the orders she'd received from elders. Thomas Crane provided detailed testimony about crafting suppression devices over 30 years, his voice breaking as he admitted that his own daughter had been his first victim. But Marcus Stone was building his defense too. His legal team filed dozens of motions trying to exclude evidence on technical grounds, arguing that PAC medical records were privileged, demanding that victim identities be sealed to protect PAC privacy. They produced their own expert witnesses, traditional historians, who claimed alpha females had always been considered dangerous medical experts who suggested that suppression was more humane than execution. Legal scholars who argued pack sovereignty was absolute in matters of internal hierarchy. The traditionalist coalition grew. By the time the tribunal was scheduled, 14 pack alphas had filed supporting briefs for Marcus Stone, representing 40% of the Northern Territory's population. They weren't necessarily defending genocide explicitly, but they were defending their right to govern their packs without federal interference, even if that governance included practices the federal government deemed human rights violations. Commander Blackwood spent long nights strategizing with his team, and Sarah found herself sitting in on more and more of these sessions. The mate bond made it natural for her to be included, but she also brought a perspective. They needed the view from inside a pack that had normalized torture, the understanding of how families could convince themselves that their children's suffering was necessary. 1 week before the tribunal, Sarah woke in the middle of the night to find Commander Blackwood standing at the window of her recovery room. The mate bond had drawn her from sleep when his distress became too intense to ignore. She approached quietly, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Can't sleep. I keep thinking about what happens if we lose." His voice was rough. If the tribunal rules that pack sovereignty supersedes federal jurisdiction, in this case it sets precedent. Every pack in the territories will know they can do whatever they want to their members as long as they call it tradition. More alpha females will be born. More alpha females will die. And I'll have failed them because I couldn't build a strong enough case. You're building the strongest case possible with the evidence available. Maybe it's not enough. He turned to face her, and in the dim light she could see the weight he carried. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. If we win this tribunal, if we get jurisdiction to prosecute this, turns into a years-long legal battle. Multiple trials, appeals, constant media attention. Your life won't be private anymore. You'll be the alpha female who survived the face of this genocide, the symbol of everything wrong with pack traditionalism. That's a heavy burden, I know. And if we lose Marcus Stone, we'll use his victory to further discredit alpha females. He'll point to the failed prosecution as proof that what he did was right, that federal investigators overreached, that you were used as a political pawn. Either way, your suffering becomes public property." Sarah moved to stand beside him at the window, looking out at the Iron Ridge territory that had been her prison for a decade. "It's already public property. The moment you remove those bans in front of witnesses, my story stopped being just mine. And honestly, I'm okay with that. If my suffering can prevent even one other girl from ending up in silver bands, then making it public is worth it." Commander Blackwood's hand found hers, careful of her scarred wrists. "You're stronger than most alphas I know." "I'm really not. I'm just too stubborn to stay quiet." "There's a difference." He almost smiled at that. The first time Sarah had seen anything approaching humor from him since they'd met. Maybe stubbornness is its own kind of strength. They stood together at the window until dawn broke over Iron Ridge, neither speaking, connected through a mate bond they'd both acknowledged but hadn't yet fully explored. There would be time for that later, after the tribunal, after the prosecution, after justice was served or denied. For now, they had a case to present and a genocide to expose. The tribunal would determine everything. The Federal Pack Tribunal convened in Seattle on a Tuesday morning that smelled like rain and institutional tension. Sarah stood outside the courthouse watching delegates arrive from 20 different packs, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to openly hostile, and tried to control the shaking in her hands that had nothing to do with nerve damage. Commander Blackwood appeared at her side, his presence steadying through the mate bond before he even spoke. "You don't have to watch them arrive. We can wait inside. I want to see them." Sarah kept her eyes on the entrance where Marcus Stone was currently ascending the steps, flanked by his legal team, and looking confident despite being the defendant in a genocide investigation. "I want to see every person who thinks what happened to me was justified. Want to remember their faces." Emma Chen joined them, her neck still bandaged where the collar had been removed 3 weeks ago. Her parents stood nearby, their expressions tight with fear, but determined. The 16-year-old girl had grown steadier in recent weeks, her wolf integrating now that suppression was lifted. But she still flinched whenever older alphas looked at her directly. Inside the tribunal chamber was designed for exactly this kind of high-stakes proceeding. 3 judges sat at an elevated bench: Judge Rebecca Stone from the federal judiciary, Judge Marcus Winter from traditional pack courts, and Judge Helen Okonkwo from the International Council serving as neutral tiebreaker. Below them, prosecution and defense tables faced each other across an aisle that felt like a battlefield. Gallery seating held representatives from every major PAC in the Northern Territories, plus media observers who'd been allowed in after intense debate. Attorney General Patricia Morrison led the prosecution team, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and a reputation for dismantling institutional corruption. She'd spent the past 3 weeks preparing for this case like it was the most important of her career, which Commander Blackwood said it probably was. Beside her sat the commander himself in dress uniform, Lieutenant Gray similarly formal, and Dr. Torres with her medical evidence organized in pristine binders. The defense table held Robert Thorne, a constitutional law expert who'd built his career on PAC sovereignty cases, flanked by 3 junior attorneys and Marcus Stone himself. The elder sat with perfect posture, his expression serene, like a man who genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong. Judge Stone called the tribunal to order at precisely 9 o'clock. This proceeding will determine whether the federal PAC investigation has jurisdiction to pursue criminal charges related to the treatment of alpha females in Iron Ridge PAC and associated territories. The defense has challenged federal authority on grounds of PAC sovereignty and traditional autonomy. The prosecution must demonstrate that federal jurisdiction supersedes PAC law in matters of human rights violations. We will hear opening statements, examine evidence, question witnesses, and render judgment. This is a legal proceeding, not a trial. We are determining jurisdiction only. Sarah understood the distinction, but hated it. They weren't arguing whether Marcus Stone had tortured her, that was established fact. They were arguing whether torturing her had been his legal right as a PAC elder enforcing traditional law. Morrison stood for the opening statement, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. May it please the tribunal. This case concerns systematic genocide spanning 30 years across 15 PACs in the Northern Territories. 53 confirmed victims, all female, alpha designated, all killed or severely harmed through coordinated suppression protocols. The defense will argue PAC sovereignty. They will say internal PAC matters are beyond federal reach. They will claim tradition justifies their actions. But genocide is not a PAC matter. Child torture is not protected tradition, and this tribunal must affirm that basic human rights supersede any claim of autonomy. She paused, letting that sink in. Over the next 3 weeks, you will hear from survivors who were locked in silver devices that burned them constantly for years. You will see evidence of infants executed on elder orders. You will review documentation proving this was not isolated abuse, but coordinated policy. And you will face a simple question. Does PAC sovereignty include the right to commit genocide? We believe the answer is clearly no. Thorne rose for the defense, his manner respectful but firm. May it please the tribunal. No one disputes that tragic situations occurred. No one claims alpha females weren't treated harshly by traditional standards. But this tribunal must consider whether federal government can criminalize actions that were legal under PAC law when they occurred. Can prosecutors reach back years or decades and apply modern standards to historical practices? Can they override PAC autonomy whenever they disagree with internal policies? He gestured toward Marcus Stone. My client followed established protocols. He acted within authority granted by his PAC and consistent with centuries of tradition. The federal PAC investigation forcibly removed suppression devices without proper legal process, then used evidence obtained through that illegal action to justify further investigation. This is government overreach. This threatens every PAC's right to self-governance, and this tribunal must reject it. The first 2 days focused on medical evidence. Dr. Torres testified about Sarah's condition when first examined, describing the extent of burn damage, nerve destruction, and systemic silver toxicity in clinical terms that made several gallery observers visibly ill. She presented photographs that showed exactly what 10 years of constant metal contact did to human tissue. She explained in detail how silver suppressed shifter abilities, how prolonged exposure caused organ damage, how death from complications was essentially guaranteed without removal. Under cross-examination, Thorne tried to undermine her testimony. Dr. Torres, is it fair to say that silver suppression while uncomfortable is not inherently lethal? Uncomfortable is a severe understatement. Torres' voice was ice. And yes, prolonged exposure is absolutely lethal. Sarah Morgan was given 5 years maximum life expectancy if the bans remained. That's not suppression, that's slow execution. But she's alive now, correct? 3 weeks post-removal and recovering, because Commander Blackwood removed the devices against pack wishes. If he hadn't intervened, she'd be dead within 5 years from toxicity. Intervention you characterize as rescue. Others might call it assault, others would be wrong. Judge Winter intervened before the exchange could escalate. Counsel will confine questions to medical matters, save legal interpretations for closing arguments. Day 3 brought forensic evidence from the exhumed bodies in Clearwater Ridge. 2 girls, ages 8 and 15, both dead 12 years ago, from what families had reported as natural causes. Bone analysis revealed extensive silver residue. Tissue samples preserved by cold burial conditions showed burn patterns consistent with suppression bans. Cause of death in both cases, septic shock from untreated infections complicated by silver toxicity. The families testified next parents who'd agreed to ban their daughters at elder insistence and watch them die slowly. The mother of the 8-year-old girl broke down completely on the stand, sobbing that she'd believed the elders when they said it was necessary that alpha females were dangerous, that suppression was mercy compared to execution. Morrison's questioning was gentle but thorough. Did anyone explain to you that alpha females aren't actually dangerous? No. The woman's voice was barely audible. They said it was natural law, that females can't be alphas without corrupting pack hierarchy, that if word spread alpha females existed, it would destabilize everything. Did you want to remove the bans when your daughter became ill? Yes. But Elder Marcus said removing them would be worse than letting her die with them on. He said if she died, it proved she was too weak to be alpha anyway. He said it was natural selection. And you believed him. He was an elder. We were taught to trust elders. The defense strategy became clear during cross-examination. Thorne didn't dispute the facts. He couldn't. The evidence was overwhelming, but he focused relentlessly on the legal framework. These parents consented to suppression as legal guardians. The pack council followed established procedures. Federal law at the time of these deaths didn't explicitly prohibit alpha female suppression. You cannot retroactively criminalize actions that were legal when performed. Judge Okonkwo interrupted that line of argument. Counsel, are you suggesting genocide is legal if no law explicitly prohibits it? I'm suggesting that pack internal matters were historically beyond federal reach. If packs believed alpha females threatened social stability and took measures within their authority to address that threat, it's questionable whether modern federal law can retroactively prosecute those decisions. Even when those measures included torturing children to death, Thorne hesitated clearly, aware he was on dangerous ground. The tragedy of these outcomes doesn't automatically grant federal jurisdiction over pack governance. Day 5 was when Sarah testified. Morrison walked her through preliminary questions, name, age, pack of origin, before moving to the ceremony when everything changed. Sarah described being 12 years old and excited for her first shift, her parents' pride transforming to horror. Elder Marcus, declaring her an abomination within seconds of her wolf emerging. What happened after Elder Marcus made that declaration? They caged me. Sarah kept her voice steady through effort. Silver-lined cage, too small to shift back even if I'd known how. I was trapped as a wolf for 3 days while they decided what to do with me. Who decided? The pack council. All 15 elders. They debated execution versus suppression and chose suppression. Did anyone suggest acceptance, training, integration? No. It was assumed I was wrong, corrupted, dangerous. The only question was how to correct me. Tell the tribunal about the bans. Sarah held up her wrists, scars visible even from the gallery. Pure silver, 3 inches wide, locked tight against skin, with no gap for healing. They burned constantly. Every second of every day for 10 years. The flesh underneath never healed because the source of damage never moved. I developed infections, nerve damage, arthritis, bone density, loss, systemic toxicity. I was told I'd die before 30. The bans were supposed to suppress my wolf, but really they were just killing me slowly. Morrison introduced photographs as evidence, medical records documenting a decade of suffering. Did you ever consent to wearing these bands? I was 12 and being held down by adults while a silversmith locked metal around my wrists? Consent wasn't part of the process. Did your parents defend you? My father agreed it was necessary. My mother said nothing. They moved me to servants' quarters 3 months later because having me in the family home reminded them of their shame. Shame that you existed, shame that they'd produced an alpha female, that their daughter was what the pack considered an abomination. The prosecution phase of Sarah's testimony took 2 hours. Morrison methodically established every element of torture, institutional complicity, and genocide intent. By the time she finished, several judges were visibly affected, and even some of the traditionalist pack representatives in the gallery looked uncomfortable. Then Thorne stood for cross-examination, and Sarah braced herself. Ms. Morgan, tragic as your experience was, isn't it true that pack law at the time permitted suppression of dangerous shifters? I wasn't dangerous. I was 12. But your alpha wolf was unprecedented in Iron Ridge pack. Correct an unknown variable that pack leaders had no framework for managing. Being unprecedented doesn't make someone dangerous. The pack elders disagreed, and as the legal authority within their pack, they had the right to make that determination. They had the authority. Whether they had the right is what this tribunal is deciding. Thorne shifted tactics. You testified that you were in pain constantly for 10 years. Yet you survived. You worked. You functioned. Isn't it possible the suppression was less severe than you now characterize? Sarah felt anger rising but controlled it. I survived because I'm stubborn, not because the torture was mild. I worked because I had no choice. It was work or be expelled from the pack as rogue, which would have meant death anyway. I functioned at minimum capacity while my body slowly broke down. If you want to call that less severe, you are welcome to wear silver bands locked against your wrists for a decade and see how you feel. Several people in the gallery made sounds of approval before Judge Stone called for order. Ms. Morgan, isn't it true that Commander Blackwood removed your bands by force without proper legal authorization, causing you significant pain in the process? He removed them because they were killing me. The pain of removal was temporary. The pain of keeping them on was killing me. But he didn't get your informed consent first. He made the decision for you. I told him I wanted them off. That's consent. After he'd already begun the process, after he'd used Alpha Command to compel you to show him your wrists. Some might argue you were coerced. Some might argue that 10 years of torture negates any concern about coercion in the removal process. Thorne tried several more approaches, attempting to suggest Sarah's testimony was exaggerated or that she'd been manipulated by federal investigators looking for justification to expand their authority. But Sarah had lived this experience. Every answer came from direct knowledge, and no legal maneuvering could undermine that fundamental truth. When she finally stepped down after 3 hours on the stand, Commander Blackwood was waiting. He didn't touch her, they were in public professional setting, but his presence through the mate bond was steady support. You did well, better than well. You gave them truth they can't ignore. Emma Chen testified next, describing her 6 years in the silver collar with the perspective of someone younger, more recently traumatized. Her testimony was shorter but equally powerful, especially when she showed the tribunal the burn scars circling her neck like a grotesque necklace. The Riverbend midwife testified on day 7, her voice breaking as she described suffocating 3 alpha female infants on elder orders over 20 years. I was told it was mercy, that letting them live would only cause suffering when they were older. I was told alpha females who survived went mad, became violent, destroyed packs. I believed them. I murdered 3 babies because I believed them. Under questioning from Morrison, she admitted that she'd never actually seen evidence of alpha females being dangerous, that all her information came from pack elders, that she'd acted on traditional beliefs without questioning their accuracy. Thorne's cross-examination focused on her state of mind. You genuinely believed you were acting in the infant's best interests. I thought I was preventing suffering. You followed orders from legitimate pack authority. Yes, you had no reason to believe those orders were illegal at the time. Numbered pack elders had absolute authority over life and death decisions. The defense was building its case. These weren't crimes, they were pack governance decisions made by people acting in good faith under legal authority they possessed at the time. Day 9 brought Thomas Crane to the stand, and his testimony shifted the momentum. Morrison asked him to describe his role as pack silversmith. Thomas explained his 30 years crafting ceremonial items, jewelry, and yes, suppression devices. He'd made 6 sets of suppression bands over 3 decades. He'd fitted each one personally. Tell the tribunal about the first suppression device you made. Thomas's voice was hollow. It was for my daughter, Lisa. She shifted alpha female at age 10 30 years ago. Elder Marcus ordered bands. I made them. I locked them around her wrists. She wore them for 3 months before infection killed her. Morrison let that sit for a moment before continuing. You made the bands that killed your own daughter. Yes, why? Because I believed what the elders told me, that alpha females were abominations, that suppression was mercy compared to execution, that it was my duty to protect pack hierarchy even if it meant hurting my child. Do you still believe that? Number Thomas looked at Sarah directly. I believe lies built on 200-year-old propaganda. I murdered my daughter for a political narrative disguised as tradition. And then I tortured 6 more girls because I'd already committed to the lie so deeply that admitting I'd been wrong would mean admitting I'd killed Lisa for nothing. Morrison introduced the Silver Protocol into evidence, the 47-page instruction manual Thomas had helped distribute. Walked the tribunal through this document. Thomas did, explaining each section in clinical detail. Identification procedures for alpha females. Assessment criteria for whether suppression or execution was more appropriate. Precise specifications for suppression devices, including silver purity requirements. Long-term management protocols. Disposal procedures if suppression failed. Who created this protocol? Elder Marcus Stone assembled it from practices developed across multiple packs over decades. It standardized approaches, shared techniques, coordinated responses. It turned isolated abuse into systematic genocide. Thorne's cross-examination tried to paint Thomas as a disgruntled accomplice seeking to shift blame. You participated in these practices for 30 years. Now you're testifying against other participants to avoid prosecution yourself. I'm testifying because what we did was wrong. Thomas's voice was steady. Yes, I participated. Yes, I'm complicit. And yes, I'm cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. But that doesn't make my testimony false. I made those devices. I distributed that protocol. I helped build a system designed to erase alpha females from existence. That's true regardless of my motivations for admitting it now. Day 12 brought the defense witnesses. Traditional historians testified that alpha females had historically been viewed as dangerous, though under Morrison's cross-examination, they admitted that most historical accounts came from the same 200-year period Thomas had identified as politically motivated. Medical experts suggested that suppression was more humane than execution, though they couldn't explain why those were the only 2 options considered. Legal scholars argued pack sovereignty was absolute in internal matters, though they struggled to define where internal governance ended and human rights violations began. The defense's strongest witness was actually Elder William Cross from Cascade Pack, who claimed direct knowledge of violent alpha females in the past. He brought what he said were original documents from 70 years ago describing an alpha female who'd killed 3 pack members during a dominance dispute. Morrison cross-examined carefully. Elder Cross, you've presented one case from 70 years ago as evidence that alpha females are inherently dangerous. How many male alphas killed pack members in dominance disputes during that same period? I don't have those statistics readily available. More than one, certainly, probably many more. Yet we don't suppress all male alphas as preventively dangerous based on those incidents. Male alphas are necessary for pack structure. And alpha females aren't it historically, no. The pack hierarchy functions with male alphas and female omegas, or betas. Functions according to whom? Did the moon goddess issue a manual specifying this structure? Or did packs develop these hierarchies and then declare them divinely ordained? Cross had no good answer for that. Day 15 was closing arguments. Morrison spoke for 2 hours, systematically dismantling the sovereignty defense. Pack autonomy exists to allow cultural diversity and local governance. It does not exist to permit genocide. It does not exist to allow child torture. It does not exist to justify systematic murder of individuals based on gender and genetic traits they cannot control. The defense asks you to rule that what happened to Sarah Morgan was legal pack governance. I ask you to recognize it for what it was: a crime against humanity disguised as tradition. She paused, making eye contact with each judge. 53 victims over 30 years. Babies suffocated in cribs. Children locked in silver devices that burned them until infections killed them. Teenagers told they were abominations for existing. All of this coordinated through the Silver Protocol, all of it sanctioned by pack elders who claimed authority to decide which children deserve to live. If pack sovereignty protects this, then PAC sovereignty must be limited, because no government structure, no cultural tradition, no claim of autonomy supersedes basic human rights. Thorne's closing argument lasted 90 minutes. He conceded that outcomes were tragic, but insisted the question before the tribunal was jurisdiction, not morality. Did PAC leaders exceed their authority? No. Did they follow established procedures? Yes. Did federal law at the time explicitly prohibit their actions? No. Therefore, regardless of how abhorrent we might find these practices, now they were legal when performed. And criminalizing them retroactively sets dangerous precedent for federal overreach into any PAC practice the government dislikes. He concluded with a warning. Rule for the prosecution today, and you've ruled that federal government can prosecute any PAC leader for any traditional practice if modern values deem it offensive. Rule for the defense, and you've affirmed that PACs have genuine autonomy to govern themselves even when those governance decisions are controversial. The choice is clear. The tribunal recessed to deliberate. Commander Blackwood's team reconvened in their hotel conference room to wait, knowing the judges could take days or even weeks to reach a decision on something this significant. Sarah sat by the window watching Seattle rain and trying not to think about what happened if they lost. If the tribunal ruled that Marcus Stone had acted within his authority, if PAC sovereignty protected genocide, if her 10 years of torture were legally sanctioned, what did that mean for the future? How many more alpha females would die because the law said their murders were internal PAC matters? Emma Chen was curled in a chair nearby, her parents protectively close. The girl had grown steadier during the tribunal, her testimony cathartic in some way, but she still carried fear that PAC retaliation would come eventually, regardless of legal outcomes. Lieutenant Gray worked on his laptop, already preparing appeal strategies if the ruling went against them. Dr. Torres reviewed medical evidence, double-checking that every piece of documentation was preserved properly. Agent Park coordinated with other jurisdictions, building parallel cases in case federal prosecution was blocked. Commander Blackwood stood near Sarah but didn't intrude on her space, giving her room to process. The mate bond thrummed between them, acknowledged but still not fully explored, because there'd been no time, no space, no moment when the weight of the tribunal wasn't pressing down on everything else. On the third day of deliberation, Judge Stone recalled both parties to the chamber. Sarah's hands were shaking as she took her seat in the gallery. Emma reached over and gripped her scarred wrist gently, the 16-year-old offering solidarity to the woman whose testimony had paved the way for her own freedom. Judge Stone read the ruling in a voice that showed no emotion. This tribunal has carefully considered all evidence, witness testimony, and legal arguments presented by both parties. We have examined the question of federal jurisdiction over PAC matters involving the treatment of alpha females. Our ruling is as follows. The chamber was absolutely silent. We find that while PAC sovereignty is a legitimate principle protecting cultural autonomy and local governance, it does not constitute unlimited authority to violate fundamental human rights. The systematic targeting, torture, and killing of alpha females based solely on gender and genetic traits constitutes genocide under federal law. Such actions exceed any reasonable interpretation of internal PAC governance and fall squarely within federal jurisdiction for prosecution. Sarah felt her breath catch. Several people in the gallery gasped. Marcus Stone's expression remained impassive, but his lawyers were already scribbling notes, no doubt preparing appeals. Judge Stone continued. The defense argued that PAC leaders followed legal procedures available to them at the time. We acknowledge that suppression of alpha females may have been technically permitted under PAC law as it existed decades ago. However, ignorance of federal human rights protections does not excuse genocide. Tradition does not justify systematic murder. The fact that these practices were coordinated and institutionalized makes them more egregious, not less culpable. Regarding the specific question of whether Commander Blackwood exceeded his authority in removing Sarah Morgan's suppression bans, we find that he acted appropriately under emergency medical circumstances. The bans constituted ongoing torture, an imminent threat to life. His intervention was rescue, not assault. All evidence obtained subsequent to that intervention is admissible. Therefore, this tribunal rules that the federal PAC investigation has jurisdiction to pursue criminal charges against Elder Marcus Stone and associated defendants for crimes including genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, torture, child abuse, and murder. This case will proceed to formal trial in federal court. The prosecution may file charges immediately. Morrison was on her feet before the judge finished speaking. The prosecution files formal charges against Marcus Stone and 14 co-defendants on all counts described by this tribunal. We request immediate arraignment and ask that defendants be remanded to federal custody pending trial. Thorne stood immediately. The defense requests all defendants be released on recognizance. These are PAC leaders with deep community ties and no flight risk. Judge Stone considered briefly. Given the severity of charges and evidence of coordination across multiple PACs, defendants will be remanded to federal custody with bail hearings scheduled individually. Court is adjourned. The chamber erupted. Traditionalist PAC representatives were shouting about overreach and precedent. Progressive delegates were applauding. Marcus Stone was being taken into custody by federal agents, his expression finally showing cracks of fury beneath the serene mask. His 14 co-defendants were similarly processed, some going quietly, others protesting loudly about violations of PAC sovereignty. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, unable to process what had just happened. They'd won. The tribunal had ruled for jurisdiction. Marcus Stone would stand trial for what he'd done to her, for what he'd done to 53 victims across 30 years. Commander Blackwood appeared beside her, and she saw in his face the same stunned relief she felt. "We did it," his voice was rough. "They ruled for jurisdiction. The case goes forward." Emma Chen was crying, her parents holding her, while she sobbed with something between relief and residual terror. Other survivors in the gallery, families of victims, witnesses who'd testified, were embracing, celebrating, processing years of suppressed grief and anger finally being acknowledged as legitimate. But Sarah felt numb more than triumphant. The ruling was victory, yes, but it was also just the beginning. The tribunal had granted jurisdiction. Now came the actual trial, which could take years. Appeals would follow any conviction. And Marcus Stone had shown he would fight every step, rallying traditionalist support, claiming persecution, painting himself as defender of PAC culture against federal tyranny. Lieutenant Gray approached with logistics. "We need to get you out of here. Media is going to be everywhere within minutes, and traditionalist PACs are angry. You need security." The next 3 months blurred together in a haze of depositions, evidence review, and media attention Sarah had never wanted. The tribunal ruling made international news, sparking debates about PAC sovereignty and federal authority that played out across every major news network. Sarah's story became public property, her decade of torture reduced to sound bites and headlines. Commander Blackwood's team worked around the clock preparing for trial. Morrison assembled a prosecution strategy that would present victims chronologically, building a narrative of systematic genocide rather than isolated incidents. Gray coordinated security for witnesses after threats started arriving from traditionalist sympathizers. Torres continued medical documentation, ensuring every piece of evidence met forensic standards. Sarah's role during this period was complicated. She was primary witness symbol of the prosecution's case, but also a person trying to heal from a decade of trauma while living under constant security protection. The mate bond with Commander Blackwood deepened during these months, not through romance or ceremony, but through shared purpose and mutual respect. They worked together, planned together, faced threats together. 4 months after the tribunal ruling, Marcus Stone's trial began in federal court. The prosecution phase lasted 6 weeks. Morrison presented victim after victim, family after family, building a comprehensive picture of genocide that spanned 3 decades. The jury, 12 wolves selected from progressive PACs with no connection to the defendants, heard testimony from survivors like Sarah and Emma, from parents who'd lost daughters, from Thomas Crane, describing the Silver Protocol's implementation, from medical examiners who documented cause of death in exhumed remains. The defense strategy remained consistent: PAC sovereignty, good faith, application of traditional law, no intent to commit genocide because defendants genuinely believed alpha females were dangerous. Thorne argued that his clients were being prosecuted for following legal procedures that existed at the time, that changing social values didn't justify retroactive criminalization. But the evidence was overwhelming. The Silver Protocol's clinical documentation of genocide. Thomas Crane's testimony about coordinating suppression across 15 PACs. The midwife's confession about killing infants on elder orders. Sarah's scars that proved beyond doubt the torture she'd endured. On the 42nd day of trial, the jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning with verdicts. Marcus Stone guilty on all counts, including genocide, conspiracy, torture, child abuse, and 41 counts of murder. The 14 co-defendants guilty on conspiracy and various counts of murder or child abuse, depending on their specific involvement. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Judge Stone presided, the same woman who'd ruled on jurisdiction at the tribunal. Marcus Stone received life in federal prison without possibility of parole. His co-defendants received sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with investigators. Sarah attended the sentencing, but didn't speak. Morrison delivered the prosecution's recommendation. Several family members gave victim impact statements, but Sarah had said what she needed to say during testimony. Watching Marcus Stone be led away in chains was closure enough. The mate bond ceremony happened 3 months after the trial concluded. Not immediately, not rushed by circumstances or trauma, but when both Sarah and Commander Blackwood were ready to acknowledge what had been building between them since the moment the bond snapped into place. The ceremony was private, attended only by Commander Blackwood's core team and a few wolves from Sarah's past who'd supported her. Emma Chen stood as Sarah's witness, the 16-year-old girl representing the future they were fighting to protect. Lieutenant Gray stood for Commander Blackwood, his military brother, who'd been beside him through every stage of investigation and trial. Sarah wore simple clothes and made no attempt to hide her scars. When she spoke her vows, she looked directly at Commander Blackwood and said what she'd learned through everything they'd survived together. "You found me caged in silver and freed me, even though it caused pain. You investigated when it would have been easier to look away. You fought for justice when tradition demanded silence. You gave me back my wolf and my life. I choose you as my mate, not because the moon goddess decreed it, but because you earned my trust and respect through actions that proved your worth." Commander Blackwood's vows were equally direct. You survived a decade of torture that should have killed you. You testified when silence would have been safer. You stood against genocide when it would have been easier to hide. You proved that alpha females are not abominations, but leaders who've been systematically erased. I choose you as my mate because your strength humbles me and your courage inspires me. I will stand beside you as equal partner, not savior to victim, for as long as we both live. The bond completion was powerful but not overwhelming, a natural extension of what they'd already built, rather than dramatic transformation. They were already partners. The ceremony just made it official. 6 months later, when Iron Ridge Pack needed a new alpha after Derek Hayes was stripped of his position for complicity in Sarah's torture, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Commander Blackwood offered her the position of Luna in Stormhaven, his pack, his territory. It would have been the easier choice, the safer choice, living where she was already accepted and protected. But Sarah chose differently. She applied to become Alpha of Iron Ridge, the pack that had tortured her for 10 years, and underwent the formal challenge process that any Alpha candidate had to complete. She won the challenge through combination of Alpha dominance and tactical thinking, proving to skeptical pack members that she was qualified through ability, not just sympathy. Commander Blackwood supported her decision completely, even though it meant they would lead separate packs, would be apart, more than together would have a long-distance mate bond that defied traditional expectations. "You need to do this," he'd said when she first proposed it. "You need to lead the pack that tried to break you and show them that alpha females aren't abominations, but leaders they should have had all along." Sarah's installation as Alpha of Iron Ridge happened on a cold November morning, exactly 2 years after Commander Blackwood had removed her silver bands. The ceremony was witnessed by representatives from 30 packs, including all the progressive leaders who'd supported the prosecution and several traditionalists who'd opposed it, but now had to accept the new reality. Sarah stood in the Great Hall where she'd once been declared an abomination and addressed the pack that had been her prison. She wore formal alpha attire and made no attempt to hide the scars on her wrists. "I stood in this hall 12 years ago. I was 12 years old. I had just shifted for the first time. I was excited, proud, happy, and then you told me I was an abomination, that my wolf was wrong, that I needed to be corrected. You put silver bands on my wrists. You locked them tight. You told me to be grateful." Her voice was steady, carrying to every corner of the hall where pack members stood in mandatory attendance. "I wore those bands for 10 years. They burned every moment of every day. They damaged my body permanently. They nearly killed me. But I survived. And now I stand here as your alpha." She paused, making eye contact with wolves she recognized from her decade in servants' quarters. "Not because I need your acceptance. Not because I need to prove I'm not an abomination, but because I choose to lead you. I choose to show you that alpha females are strong, capable, qualified leaders, that the moon goddess creates us for a reason, that suppressing us weakened your pack for a generation. Under my leadership, Iron Ridge will never again torture a child for being born different. If an alpha female emerges in this pack, she will be celebrated. She will be trained. She will be integrated. Because I will make sure no child suffers what I suffered." The pack howled acceptance, some genuine, some reluctant, all of them acknowledging her authority because she'd earned it through the formal challenge process, and her alpha wolf radiated dominance none could deny. 2 years later, Sarah stood in the same hall welcoming a 9-year-old girl named Rebecca, who just shifted into an alpha female at her first ceremony. The girl's parents were terrified, clearly remembering what had happened to Sarah and fearing history would repeat. But Sarah knelt before the massive wolf pup and said what no one had said to her. "You're beautiful, you're powerful, you're exactly what the moon goddess created you to be. We're going to train you, teach you to control your strength, help you integrate into the pack. You're not an abomination, Rebecca. You're an alpha, and you're welcome here." The girl's parents wept with relief. The pack accepted the child without protest, having learned through Sarah's leadership that alpha females strengthened rather than threatened their community. In Stormhaven, Commander Blackwood continued leading federal pack investigations while also serving as Sarah's mate and partner across the distance between their territories. They saw each other every 2 weeks, maintained constant communication through phone and video, and made the long-distance mate bond work through mutual respect and shared purpose. Emma Chen graduated from high school at 18 and enrolled in pre-law, determined to become an attorney who could represent alpha females if suppression cases emerged elsewhere. Her collar scars had faded to thin silver lines around her neck that she wore openly as a reminder of what she'd survived. Thomas Crane served his probation helping dismantle suppression device networks in other territories, using his silversmith expertise to identify and destroy tools of torture. He would never forgive himself for killing his daughter, but he dedicated his remaining years to preventing other fathers from making his mistake. Marcus Stone died in federal prison at age 79 after serving 12 years of his life sentence. He never recanted, never admitted wrongdoing, never acknowledged that alpha females were anything except abominations. He died believing he had been right and history would eventually vindicate him. But history did the opposite. The Federal Alpha Female Protection Act passed 3 years after the trial, establishing that alpha females had identical rights to male alphas across all territories. Suppression devices were illegal to manufacture, possess, or use. Prenatal testing that targeted alpha female traits was prohibited. Any pack discovered implementing suppression protocols faced immediate federal intervention. A memorial was established in Seattle listing 53 names, the confirmed victims of the genocide that Marcus Stone had coordinated. Sarah attended the dedication ceremony and stood before the wall of names, reading each one aloud, acknowledging the alpha females who'd never gotten the chance to lead, to thrive, to simply exist. 10 years after the tribunal ruling, Sarah stood on the balcony of Iron Ridge's pack house and looked out over territory that had been her prison and was now her domain. Her wrists ached, they always ached, the nerve damage permanent, but the pain was bearable, finite, nothing compared to what she'd endured. Commander Blackwood stood beside her, visiting for their monthly meeting where they coordinated policies between Stormhaven and Iron Ridge. The mate bond thrummed between them, steady and strong, despite the distance their separate leadership required. "You changed everything," he said, his voice carrying pride and possessive certainty. The girl who wore silver bands for 10 years grew up to lead the pack that tortured her. That strength most alphas will never understand. Sarah touched her scarred wrists, the permanent reminder of a decade that had defined and nearly destroyed her. "I was 12 years old when they locked silver around my wrists. They told me I was an abomination that needed correction. It took 10 years of burning to realize the truth. The only thing that needed correction was them." She looked at Commander Blackwood, her mate and partner, the AlphaKing who'd freed her when freedom seemed impossible. "I survived because I refused to believe their lies. And now I lead because I refuse to let another child believe them either." In the distance, young Rebecca was training with other adolescent wolves, her alpha female presence accepted and integrated exactly as Sarah had promised. The girl would never wear silver bands. She would never be told she was wrong. She would grow up knowing that alpha females were leaders, were powerful, were blessed by the moon goddess, just as any other wolf. That was Sarah's legacy. Not the torture she'd survived, but the future she'd secured. Not the victim she'd been, but the alpha she'd become. The silver bands were gone. The wolf was free. And the pack that had tried to break her now followed her leadership with the understanding that suppressing strength had never made them stronger. It had only revealed their weakness. Sarah Morgan Alpha of Iron Ridge looked out over her territory and knew that every scar on her wrists was worth it for this moment, this victory, this future where alpha females would never again be called abominations.